Good evening. This is the man in the corner seat. Tonight I'll be reading a further tale from Mark Ronsons' book Super Ghosts. The Mountain Terror. Clammy mist swirled about the lone mountaineer as he picked his way down the stone-covered slope. Earlier in the day he had reached the cairn which stands at the summit of Ben Macdhui, the highest mountain in Scotland's Cairngorm range. As he began the return journey, a curtain of white fog descended upon him. With it came an eerie silence. The man, moving cautiously in the mist, was Norman Colley, a professor of chemistry at London University and an enthusiastic climber. He felt no alarm at the sudden blotting out of the landscape. It had to be expected on Ben Macdhui. Having climbed the mountain before, he was confident that before long he would be enjoying supper in front of a log fire at his lodgings. Suddenly, he paused. Through the eerie stillness came a faint sound. It reminded Professor Colley of a footstep, the crunch of someone stepping on small stones which littered the slope. But that would be ridiculous. At the summit the view had been clear, and he would have noticed any other mountaineers in the vicinity. He was convinced that he was the only one. Crunch. The professor knew that changes in temperature sometimes created a noise as rocks contracted or expanded, but such a sound was usually a sharp crack. No matter what explanation he could think of, he had to admit to himself that it could only be a footfall. Crunch. There it was again. This is nonsense, the professor muttered to himself as a pang of fear shot through him. He began to hurry now as the sound of more footsteps reached his ears. He stopped and looked about him in the mist, but all he could see was a milky whiteness in each direction. Then, as he walked forward again, the mysterious sounds became more distinct. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, the professor was to relate afterwards. And then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. He was seized with terror at the thought of something huge and unknown stalking him on the mountainside. He fled, racing down the slope, blundering into boulders which suddenly loomed up out of the mist, and all the time aware of the crunching sound behind him. At last he emerged from the mist above the Rothiemachus forest, and several miles from where he had begun his mad race. He was alone. Whatever it was that had inspired such panic in him was somewhere back in the mist. This episode took place in 1891, but it was not until 1925 that the professor told his story publicly at a meeting of the Cairngorm Club in Aberdeen. "Whatever you make of it, I do not know," he said, "but there is something very queer about the top of Ben Macdhui, and I will not go back there again by myself, that I can tell you." Reporters wrote about similar happenings which had been experienced on the mountain. One of the most interesting appeared in the Aberdeen Press and Journal, written by a Mr. W.G. Robertson, who had heard it from an old mountaineering friend named Henry Kellis. Henry and his brother, Dr. A.M. Kellis, a very famous mountaineer who tragically lost his life on an Everest expedition, were below the summit of Ben Macdhui late one afternoon when suddenly they saw a giant figure coming down towards them from the cairn. They saw it pass out of sight in a dip, and while waiting for it to reappear, were attacked by the same feeling of panic as Professor Colley. "They were aware it was following them," wrote Mr. Robertson, "and tore down by Cair Echachen. Mr. Kellis said that there was a mist on part of the hill, but refused to believe that the figure could be the shadow of either his brother or himself. He asked why not 2 figures if that had been the case. No one who knew Mr. Kellis or heard him relate this story could doubt his complete faith in his experience. Since then there have been many reports of the Big Grey Man, as the apparition came to be named. A typical example of the terror which the Big Grey Man inspired occurred on the mountain in 1945. One morning in May, a mountaineer named Peter Densham, who had been employed on aircraft rescue work during the Second World War, set out from Aviemore and reached the summit of Ben Macdhui by midday. The weather was fine and clear, but as he ate his packed lunch, a heavy mist covered the mountain. For a while he continued to eat in the moist silence. Then he began to hear things and remembered the strange tales. In the past he had not believed them, but now he felt that there was someone or something close to him. Then he heard a crunching noise from the direction of the cairn on his left. Peter Densham later recalled how his thoughts turned to the big grey man and the sound his footsteps were supposed to make. He was still not frightened, explaining that he thought the experience was interesting. But when the crunching was only yards away, he was engulfed by a sudden wave of panic, and all he wanted to do was get off that mountain. He began running wildly and realized that he was fleeing towards Lurcher's Crag, a route which would end with him toppling to his death. He fought to halt his panic-stricken flight, but found it impossible. It was as though there was a murderous force pushing him onwards. With a supreme effort of will, he managed to change direction. He raced down a ridge to the Altmore Bridge and on past Glenmore, and only stopped running when he was on the other side of the loch. A fascinating story of an encounter with the big grey man, not just the sound of his footsteps, is given in Richard Frere's book, Thoughts of a Mountaineer. In order to win a bet, a friend of his set himself an endurance test of spending a midwinter night camped beside Ben Macdhui cairn. During the night he awoke with a start of fear and a horrible sensation of being paralysed. As he lay still in his sleeping bag, his eyes focused on a white patch on the wall of his tent. It was caused by a ray of moonlight coming through an opening in the fly sheet, and as he watched, a blurred shadow moved across it. Something was close at hand and had moved between his tent and the moon. The man said afterwards that he felt he was in deadly danger, that whatever it was which had cast the shadow was hostile towards him. As he watched, the shadow vanished, and this in some way released the tension which was paralysing him. Now his fear was mixed with curiosity, and inch by inch he crawled out of his sleeping bag, parted the opening of the tent, and gazed at the wild moonlit scene. At a distance of about 18 metres, he saw a huge creature swaggering down the slope. It appeared to be covered with thin brown hair, and had a head so large it was out of proportion to its body. The mountaineer said he was sure it was not some sort of ape, because its arms were not long like those of a monkey. A few moments later the figure vanished, and the shivering man returned to his sleeping bag, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was a fellow climber wrapped up in bulky alpine clothing. Seemed a pretty unlikely explanation, but it was the only one he could think of. When the sun rose over the Cairngorms, the man tried a simple but ingenious experiment to try and find out the height of the midnight prowler. There was no snow in the gully down which it had marched, so there would be no footprints to give it a clue. But the mountaineer remembered that he had not been able to see the creature's feet while it passed a certain boulder which lay on the slope. This meant that it had been on the other side of the rock. He paced out the distance and reckoned it to be about 23 metres from his tent, then planted his ice axe by the boulder and returned to the opening of the tent. When the creature's feet had been hidden by the boulder, its head had still appeared silhouetted just above the horizon. By making a comparison between the length of the ice axe, which stood nearly a metre above the ground, and the line of the horizon, he was able to gain a rough indication of the creature's height. He said that it could not make it less than 8 lengths of his axe, and twice he made it 10, which meant that the figure was between 7 and 9 metres in height. It was exactly what he had thought at the time. A story of an enormous creature roaming an icy Scottish peak in the middle of winter may seem fantastic, and even more so is the description of an encounter with the big grey man which appeared in the Scots magazine in June of 1958. Here the author, a naturalist and climber named Alexander Chu Neon, claimed that he had actually shot at it. It was in 1943, when he had gone climbing in the Cairngorm Mountains in the hope of shooting some game to eke out wartime rations. On the afternoon he reached the summit of Ben Macdhui. Mist began to form in the pass below, and a rising wind moaned in the rocks above him. His mountaineering instinct told him that a storm was approaching, and, anxious to avoid it, he began to descend by what is known as the Kori Echachen track. It was when he reached the mist that he heard the footsteps. Footsteps with frighteningly long intervals between them. Suddenly Chuinan found himself gazing at a huge shadowy shape looming up out of the mist. For a moment it was hidden by the mist, then it was visible again, coming straight for him. He raised his gun and fired 3 times, then took to his heels and raced down the path to Glenderry in time he never bettered. It would seem that the bullets did no harm to the big grey man, as sightings of him have increased since then. But the questions remain. What is it that haunts Britain's second highest mountain? Could it be something like the Loch Ness Monster, which has survived from a prehistoric age? Is it the ghost of some such creature which returns to the mountain over which it once roamed? Or is it the personification of an evil force? It is an interesting point that those who have seen or heard the big grey man admit to being filled with terror, and mountaineers are not easily frightened. Such an attack of fear was described by Wendy Wood in her book The Secret of Spey. She was on the lower slope of the mountain when she heard an enormous, harsh voice echoing around her. She was too surprised to pick out any words, but she thought they sounded like Gaelic, the old language of the Scots. At first she looked for some natural cause. Perhaps it was the barking of a deer magnified by a freak echo. Then it seemed the sounds were coming from beneath her feet. She searched the snow in a widening circle in case an injured climber lay beneath it, and what she was hearing were his cries for help. She found no one, and the fear which she had been trying to keep in check suddenly overwhelmed her. Her only thought was to get away, and as she ran from the spot she was certain that something sinister was following her. It took the same giant strides which had frightened Professor Colley. Stumbling desperately down the Lean Gru Pass, she fled from those crunching footsteps throughout stopping, or without stopping, for breath until she found herself near Whitewall. Another woman to experience such a panic attack was the writer Joan Grant. One fine summer day in 1928 she was walking with her husband in the Rothechern forest, close to Ben Macdhui, when she was seized by a sensation of sheer terror. She turned and raced back along the path, with her husband running after her, demanding to know what was wrong. All she could reply was that they must run faster, faster. Afterwards she wrote that she knew that something evil was trying to reach her, and that, if it did, she would die. I had run about half a mile when I burst through an invisible barrier, behind which I was safe, she said. I knew I was safe now, though a second before I had been in mortal danger. A year later, one of my father's professors described an almost exactly similar experience when bug hunting in the Cairngorms. He had been so profoundly startled that he wrote to the Times and received a letter from a reader who had also been pursued by the Thing. In her book, Time Out of Mind, Joan Grant wrote of a sinister sequel to her experience, when some years later the local doctor told her that 2 lost hikers for whom search parties had been out 3 days had been found dead. He showed her the place on a large-scale map, and it was the exact spot which she had fled from the invisible menace. Both men were in their 20s, and had spent a good night under what is known as Shelterstone, on the lower slope of Ben Macdhui. This was known because they had written their names and date in a book, which is kept there in a waterproof wrapping. But after that no one knew what actually happened, though it was easy enough to guess. The searchers found their bodies within 90 meters of each other, sprawled face down, as though death had struck them in headlong flight. The doctor told Joan Grant that he had examined them, and never in his life had he seen healthier corpses, not a thing being wrong with either of them, except that their hearts had stopped. I put heart failure on the chip, the doctor said, but it is my considered opinion that they died of fright. This is the man in the corner seat, saying thank you for listening, and good night, till the next time.